All right, hello, welcome back to Dan's Astrology. I'm here for another video, this time on Mars in Libra making a square to Jupiter in Cancer. Now, I have to admit, first of all, I'm going to be taking a different direction with this video. Last time, I kind of forego my usual stuff, and I did a video about self-help books. Today, I'm taking it in a completely different direction, and I'm going to be talking about politics. But keep in mind that I have the perspective of a Canadian rather than being a citizen from America. So I'm sort of looking at, I'm going to include some Canadian political things that are just, may not be as relevant to the American audience. But first, I will acknowledge that I did a video recently about Vladimir Putin, and Putin has this massive stellium in Libra that is and he's also got Uranus in Cancer, if I remember correctly, and so I'm expecting something with Putin with this. Although this leads me into this question about, like, is it really responsible for me to be making political astrology content and making prediction? Like, there's all sorts of predictions you can make. There's all sorts of speculation you can make, and all sorts of predictions you can make. And sometimes I wonder if I should just, like, kind of just push it as far as I can go and see what kind of weird, crazy, wild speculations I can do. But for now, I'm just going to observe some things which are already happening. For example, America is apparently going to war with Venezuela, or at least they have positioned some naval ships in the area, and apparently they carried out an attack on a Venezuelan naval ship, which was apparently accused of carrying drugs. They're accusing the Venezuelan military of trafficking drugs into America. However, I think for a lot of people, there's certain kind of, when it comes to the drug trade, there has to be a certain level of corruption going on. Like, there's a lot of people who are kind of aware of conspiracy accusations where the things like crack cocaine in America there could have been like an inside job to intentionally sort of criminalize certain demographics, or to push to allow drugs into the country in certain ways. Or I don't know, I'm not like, you can do research on this, I'm sure. There's something about the use of the accusation. Of course, the drug trade is connected to South America and all this kind of stuff. But is this just a pretense to invade Venezuela because they have a lot of oil? Probably it's because of the oil, I would imagine. There's also, you have to look at the history of the Opium War and how drugs and accusations of drug trade have been used to political ends historically, and basically how this has colored the current political climate that we're in now. And then, oh my God, with the fact that this is timing up with an eclipse happening soon, the lunar eclipse in Pisces, this is a particularly gnarly transit. And because in the past, Mars square Jupiter things have happened, like when they had that big explosion in Beirut, that was a Mars square Jupiter. This time, though, I think it might be a little bit better, or the fact that Mars is poorly dignified in Libra may make it so that the Marsiness of this transit isn't so Marsy, and that rather than doing some like outright violent attack, it could be more like passive aggressive or indirect with Mars and Libra, because Mars is not in a sign where it's enabled to do the Mars stuff that it finds naturally, so it has to express its Marsiness in a Libra kind of way. There was recently just a big thing where the Epstein survivors had a protest or a big public thing in Washington, D.C., and that could be a good example of Mars and Libra, because it's Libra, for one thing, being a Venus-ruled sign, having to do with women, also with Libra having to do with the balance, the scales, fairness, equality, and how the controversy around this is obviously it has to do with the power imbalance of patriarchy and the fact that exploitation happens because of a hierarchical power balance that is, I don't have to, you probably understand, I don't have to spend too much time on this one. It's also, the whole thing lends itself to like, there's a lot, I mean, a lot of this stuff, whether it's war or whether it's the Epstein thing, is kind of uncomfortable. But I'm just going to try to get through a bunch of stuff. There are also more internationally, not to focus so much on the United States. There are protests erupting. Apparently, there's another. It's kind of like a new version of the yellow vest movement in France is, or they're doing some kind of mass protests. There's also apparently mass protests in places like Indonesia, and I'm not even up on it, but I think there was also in Eastern Europe, some countries like Serbia were having some protest, or Romania, maybe. I can't remember them all. It seems like there's something going around this Jupiter and Mars that could be a kind of like, lend itself to making a protest, lend itself to making a kind of a public display. And with that in mind, there's also been in the Canadian news, the closest thing we in Canada have to Donald Trump, I would argue, is Doug Ford. And Doug Ford is doing his best to fight the trade war. This time, putting on a big spectacle, pouring out a bottle of Crown Royal to protest the closing of the plant, the bottling plant that bottles Crown Royal. And I think this is a good example, I think, of the reason, what the dynamic is around this is that Crown Royal is a brand of Canadian whiskey, a popular Canadian whiskey. And like I said in my other video, I have stopped drinking since COVID, but I used to like having, making a hot toddy where it's like whiskey, you get a cinnamon stick, you put some cloves in there, some lemon juice, so you pour some hot water in it, and you have that if you have a cold. I used to drink hot toddies all the time, and Crown Royal was usually a good choice. So it's part of the Canadian tradition to use to make hot whiskey drinks to fight off cold season. And now Crown Royal will be moving its production to the United States as part of the latest move in what. You have to understand that while we're engaged in a trade war with the United States, there is within this another war happening, which are the whiskey wars, right? Being that one of Canada's main cultural commodities or sources of pride, or the sense of Canadian identity, superiority over the Americans, is our Canadian whiskey. And in this climate, the problem about this is that sometimes the Canadian brands, such as Crown Royal, have actually been bought out by huge multinational corporations that treat these things as just like the same company bought the popular Jamaican beer Red Stripe, perhaps when, I don't know, like it would be popular to sell Red Stripe beers at like, reggae festivals or something. It's like what they do is if they think a brand is going to make them money, they buy the brand. If they think the brand is going down in value, they sell the brand. And if they think Crown Royal is apparently the only Canadian brand that they own, and they've decided to just move production of Crown Royal to America to lay off all these Canadian whiskey people. And Doug Ford is pissed about this. So Doug Ford is just like, what a waste, we're going to pour out all the Crown Royal. But the point about this is that it's kind of interesting to me. There's a certain kind of Canadian politics, the way that it takes place at like turning things which are kind of, I don't know, I mean, does it, personally, I'm not that invested in this. Like I said, I stopped drinking since COVID. And, but there's this idea that like there's so many things that are produced, like the idea of localizing production of certain commodities versus the brand image of those things, and that it's Canadian in the sense that it's made in Canada by Canadian people and has a Canadian brand image, but then when it's owned by a big multinational corporation who it prioritizes, who doesn't have any real, interest in supporting Canada, they'll easily just lay off a whole factory of people and move production down to the States. There's a strategy that's been suggested by some people that the best way to respond to this is to start like making bootleg whiskeys, to like do to make like fake Crown Royal, to like, or to just like not respect trademarks and stuff like that, or to you also still have the whiskey processing facility, or the bottling plant. You could easily just make a different brand of product there if you find some other company that wants to do business with you. But it's also like this. In Canada, we have the same problem with like Tim Hortons. Tim Hortons is a very Canadian branded fast food chain where they do like coffee and donuts and sandwiches and stuff. But Tim Hortons got bought out by the same company that owns Burger King. And there's like, it's kind of funny because there's also this whole culture in Canada about how complaining about how nobody wants to work a job anymore. Oh, blah, blah, blah. Like at Tim Hortons will hire migrant workers because there was actually this union thing going on where people were trying to unionize Tim Hortons and ask for better wages, and then Tim Hortons has been very famously not very cooperative with that. And so there's the whole thing about like the question about, it's really interesting to me to see in Canadian politics about how the question about migrant workers or how nobody wants to work a job is somehow excluded of the fact of like what happens if the Canadian people that will work these jobs don't want to be paid the lowest fucking minimum wage, and they actually want to have they want to unionize and negotiate benefits and stuff like this, and then if you don't want to play ball with Canadian citizens who are educated about their labor rights, then fine, exploit the fuck out of a bunch of foreigners, right? Like that's how the whole thing works, and then slap a fucking Canadian flag on it and sell it to big multinational corporations. It's not just the migrants. You've got on one side migrants being exploited, and then huge fat cat multinational corporations making rich of it, and the Canadians are supposed to be the middleman who are there just to buy the stuff. We're just a middle class consumer class who don't work in don't neither work the job nor own the business. We just have the money to buy the product, and that we buy it because you put a little Canadian flag on it that doesn't fucking mean anything, okay? And so it's like, I think this level of like, there's a sort of like phony national brand identity stuff that I just really, as a Canadian citizen, I think it stinks. I'm not into it. I wouldn't. There's the closest place for me if I want to go for takeout food is a shitty Tim Hortons that I had a friend who was like, I was like, I don't know, maybe I'm stuck up. I have some I don't know, I'm gonna say like, if it's like you haven't seen in a while, do you want to just go for a coffee at that shitty Tim Hortons? Like, fuck no. Like yeah, like I don't want to eat. I don't want to, I don't want to live that lifestyle. Okay, sorry. With that in mind, Canadian politics is just hilarious to me because there's this whole controversy playing out with the book ban in Alberta. And for me, it's just kind of bizarre because I think that it's like obviously being done for the sake of this kind of like performance. Like, this is kind of funny because to me this relates to this whole thing. There's this meme going around about performative masculinity, and that performative masculinity is like guys who go to coffee shops and read self-help books to sort of like display to the public that they're like good guys and they're like working on themselves and they're trying to be better, to like perform, to make themselves feel appealing. And with this, the way I relate to this is that I've never really been the kind of person who likes coffee shops very much. I mean, sometimes they serve a purpose, like if you need to have a meeting with somebody, or if you need to have just a neutral location to meet or something like that. It's like a coffee shop serves a certain kind of function, and there could be many times when you are out and about and you want a coffee and the coffee shop will provide you one. But I have had this thing with I remember I was reminded by this by doing my self-help book video the other day. I was maybe playing a little bit off of this dynamic, but I had that my meditation teacher was trying to give me some sort of counseling advice and being like, well, you could just try to like get out of the house more and like go to coffee shops and like I'm like I just don't like. Why would I want to go to a coffee shop? You could go and read a book there. And it's like, this is like, to me, as somebody who likes reading a lot of books, like, it's not just, it's sort of counterintuitive to me to like go bring my book to the other side of town, to go to a coffee shop, to sit there and read, because I could do the same thing at home. The only point of doing that is that by doing that in a coffee shop, there are other people around. And then, like, what's the point? Like, I'm like, to show off that I'm reading a book to people. This is like, the point is, to me, I wouldn't naturally do this, but this, as some person who's like kind of feeling lonely and isolated and cut off from society, these are the kind of things that are recommended to us lonely, isolated men. Other people will say, why don't you go read some like good self-help books in coffee shops, and that will like get you out of feeling stuck and isolated and alone. And apparently this is being a performative male, right? Because you are literally performing this thing that somebody else tells you that what you should do to help. I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm this is one of these things that people give you as possible advice that I just never get into. And that, although I don't know, maybe I've always struggled with coffee shops. It always just feels awkward. And then the thing is like, and then if you do try to like make use of a coffee shop the way that they're intended, now you're accused of being a performative male, apparently, right? So it's like no win scenario. But based on this, there's a certain, I mean, where am I going with this? There's also this like performativity in Canadian politics, I think, around stuff like literature and reading, specifically in Alberta around the book ban, because apparently, for me, basically, I think that if you take seriously what the actual specifics of this problem are, that in public schools, certain books are being banned. Now, when I was a child growing up in the public school system, if I was looking for some kind of like edgy or different kind of reading material, I wouldn't really expect to find it just in stock at the public library to begin with. I spent a lot of time going to comic book shops, going to Chapters, going to different bookstores and things like that. And there are also public libraries as well, like just the actual library. And so it's like, even if the public school system does this thing where they ban certain books, it's not the same as saying that if you really wanted to read the book, you couldn't get it online, you couldn't buy it, you couldn't just go to the library system that's not attached to the public school system and get it there. So it's like, in terms of like the main point of this being that like, if there are children or people who are deemed questionably young for certain material and they are interested in reading it, then if they want to, they probably could without that having to like jump through that many hoops. So it's like, I don't really think whatever this is about is stopping young people from reading certain things or getting certain information, but rather to make a kind of a spectacle out of taking a hostile attitude to literature and education in general, because the fascists hate education, basically. And I think that conservatism is just a kind of a more like Overton window version of fascism, more or less, or kind of I don't know if that's going a bit overboard, but there's a kind of a fascist strain of being anti-education, especially anti-sex education, and basically. But it's kind of also obvious to me there's some dynamic here going on around the moral panic around protecting the children, especially in light of the whole Epstein controversy. But it's just sort of like, it's far removed in a way to be like, we're going to like go to public schools and try and carry out this attack on any book that might have something sexually explicit in it in a public library. it's like there's something about that. It's like, what's the point of making this such a big deal anyways? And what like it seems that there's an awful lot of energy going into this for it's kind of like what I'm trying to say is that conservative politics in Canada have turned into this thing of like Doug Ford pouring out a bottle of Crown Royal and like and Danielle Smith like I mean Danielle Smith doesn't seem like she even is really, to her credit, if you listen to what she says, she tries to play it as in not to. They don't want to take aim at the literary classics. They just want to reduce pornographic. But the funny thing about this is there's this whole other thing going on in the news around things like age restrictions and mandatory logins and all this kind of stuff for actual pornography websites. And there's this whole other question about the way children are being targeted with. Oh, there's this whole thing, the Roblox scandal, if you've heard about that. And it's just, for me, it's just bizarre because it's like, as a Canadian, it feels like you live in another universe where the politicians are like, there are certain issues out there that it's not really relevant to us directly, or at least the most we can approach this issue is to do these kinds of like performative things where you like pour out a bottle of whiskey, or you like try to like ban a bunch of books or something like that. But I actually think book bans might be good for literature, because it's like, by banning books, it creates interest about what books are being banned. Then you start to have these news articles going around where people are talking about literary classics they wouldn't normally be talking about. You're creating a certain market where like there could be like people want to like you make videos about the whole banned book lists and what's are your favorites and stuff like this. It's actually, in some way, it could be like this like counterintuitive marketing technique for the literary industry, that because people love banned book lists, right? Like everybody likes to be like, I'm gonna read something that was so edgy that they wouldn't let the kids in school read it. Like it's gonna probably revitalize the Canadian literature. It could actually be that this was maybe it's just a construction by the librarians, right? Maybe the librarians planned this to intentionally create a media spectacle to populate banned books lists, to get everybody reading Brave New World, and then they start looking at these massive hulking vehicles that they drive around that require all this specialized training and repair ability to operate. You might start looking at things in a different way, right? And then there could be other things, other certain dynamics which come to light that may not really be, it could sort of expose the biases of, why. There's this idea in martial arts that if a person is trying to if you can study how a person is guarding and the way that they're most protecting, however they're trying to be the most defensive, right, is a sign of where the weakness is, right? So if the conservatives are making sex education and access to certain literary sources and certain banned books, the books that they choose to ban are basically the conservatives volunteering what their weak point is, what the things that what they want to where their weakness is, basically, right? And I think it's at least. It reminds me, anyways, of there's this band Idols. One of the more, I don't know, they're from the UK. They're a punk rock band. Their song that they got famous with was famously included the lyric, "The best way to scare a Tory is to read and get rich," right? And that, I know nothing. I'm just sitting here looking at pretty colors, right? So basically, I think that there's a certain kind of spectacle going on where there's a kind of a frustration around the multinational corporatism, which has eaten away the big business conservative from the inside out, basically. Like it's this hollowed out rotten tree that's about to fall over or something like that, because it's just a bunch of like Tim Hortons, that's made by migrant workers, that's owned by multinational corporations, and that the best they can, this politics has now become pouring out Crown Royal and banning books, and that's the best in staging these kinds of political spectacles, right? And it's just sort of like, that's how we do it in Canada. It's kind of softball compared to what you guys in America are dealing with Epstein and going to war on Venezuela and stuff like that. And I would also just like to end this video by apologizing to America for the Canadian drug dealers who have created so much suffering and harm in your communities and have taken advantage of so many vulnerable Americans. Canada is really filled with a lot of bad people that are not well-intentioned to American neighbors. And I understand why America's upset at us. And I hope everything goes well with you with Venezuela. What can I say? Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Tune in next time. Tune in later. I'll be back with more astrology videos. Oh wait, no, that's probably good enough. Also, I had some other reading, but I'm gonna leave that for now. I think this is good enough. Okay.